Hey there, it's Tyson Sharp here. And if you're looking to move from fear into love and truly start to align with the divine, especially in business, this is the episode for you. Let's dive in. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Awaken Your Business podcast. Karen's already waving to everyone. It's exciting to be here. In the short time I've got to know Karen, things just align. I don't know how to describe it. Maybe you can describe it in your own way, but things feel very aligned, not only in terms of energy, not only in terms of what we're talking and sharing, but we're both into building communities and sharing spiritual wisdom through the godlike consciousness that's flowing through all of us. And I think that is what we're doing here. And as I was talking to Karen just before, she's saying, I think what most people need right now is just authenticity, vulnerability, openness, everything like that. And as soon as you can listen to this, no doubt, if you apply any of the stuff that you're about to listen to, your life will transform. And that's what I feel is in our spiritual guidance right now, to hear some wisdom, some true wisdom from authenticity and vulnerability. Applying that in our personal lives and in our business creates huge transformation. So, Karen, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure. I already know we're going to have an awesome time, but feel free to share. As everyone asks, what's your story? How did you get to be a spiritual mentor? How did you get to doing everything you do now?
Well, Tyson, first of all, thank you so much, brother, for having me. I'm wicked excited. And it was Kismet. I think it was just kind of like divine intervention. A couple of mutual friends of ours were like, you two have to meet. And I'm like, okay. And we did. And we just randomly, we made an appointment, we chatted, and it was just like, boom, like meant to be. So here we are. And I never, ever, ever, I say it every time, I do not take it for granted when people invite me into their world, into the hearts and ears and homes of their listeners. It's one of the highest compliments I think we can get paid, is when somebody trusts us enough with the care of those they care about. So just thank you so much for having me, number one. And here's the other thing, I'm just going to warn you. I can take a very short question and turn it into a wicked long answer. So don't be afraid if you want to stop me or interject or ask me to go deeper or pause, take a breath, because I'm a storyteller, and once I go, I go. So don't be afraid to rein me in or stop me. Okay, so how did I become a spiritual mentor? I always say, like, we got to start at the beginning. I think so often when you become, like, I'm 52, so I've been around for a little bit, okay? And I think that when you get to be at a particular point in your professional life or just in your life or whatever, and people are like, how did you, and they invite you on a show or on a stage or whatever, they're always leading with who you are now. And I'm always like, well, before we can talk about me at 52, we have to, like, go back and be like, where did this kid come from, right? Like, what happened? Because nobody really wakes up and says, especially me, a kid from Lawrence, Massachusetts, a kid from Boston, nobody, like, if you would have told me I was going to be a spiritual mentor, I would have laughed in your face. It would have been the most preposterous thing. So I'll try to do the Cliff Notes version, right, of like how I ended up here. So bottom line is, I grew up in a little city, Lawrence, Mass, which is like 7 miles wide, but it was like an immigrant city. It was a mill city. It was right on the river. So it was a textile mill. And it's like 30 miles north of Boston. And it's a tough little city, right? And it was I always say there was like the anticipation of violence was kind of like always there. And my mother and my biological father got divorced when I was 2. And then immediately the guy that ended up becoming my stepfather came onto the scene when I was like 3. So I didn't know my biological father. And at that age, like, all you know is the guy who's in front of you. You don't remember the one who was there for those very first beginning years. And so my mother and my stepfather, my mother had me when she was 20, had my sister when she was like 18, about to turn 19. So young parents, it was like babies having babies. And so even though my parents were like wicked smart, in a lot of ways, they were really dumb with like money, communication, responsibility sometimes. So I grew up in a war zone. My parents were constantly fighting, because you got to remember, like, we're talking like 20-year-olds, 21, 22, 23, like, knuckleheads. Like, we're, even when we think we know everything, but we really know nothing at that age in a lot of ways. So constantly fighting, like, whatever. They were constantly getting separated. So it was very volatile. I didn't really feel very safe. And my mother, though, my mother was like she was like the sun to my personal little planetary universe. Like she was the thing I revolved around. And she was the thing that anchored me kind of in my body, anchored me in this time and space, because she was one of those people who truly saw me. Like she saw me, she heard me, she got me. And I felt seen and loved like by her. And that's a gift. Like I just think, like I always say, like we didn't always have food in the house. We didn't always have the things we needed, but I knew my mother loved me. And that's a game, that's a game changer for a little kid. But so my parents, during one of these times when my mother and my stepfather were separated for the like gazillionth time, my mother was, a single mother. We're living in this, double-decker apartment in Lawrence. And my mother goes out one night. Which she often did. I was 12 at the time. My sister was 13, about to turn 14, like a week away from her birthday. My mother went out at night. She was supposed to meet some friends out, go bowling, whatever. And then, she would normally come home around like 11 or midnight or whatever it was. And Mrs. Turgeon, who lived downstairs, my sister's best friend, also lived downstairs. She was like keeping an eye on us, but we were like, oh, we don't need a babysitter. We're so cool, right? But we were, they were keeping an eye on us. But my mother did not come home that night. We woke up, we didn't know that when we went to bed. I just woke up the next morning and she was missing. And her car wasn't out front. There was no coffee, cup on the counter, no cigarettes in the ashtray. And it was just like really strange. Her bed had not been slept in. So my sister, I was a very naive 12-year-old. My sister was a very smart, like 13-year-old. And she sent me to school. And she just said, go to school. I don't feel good. I'm staying home. So she pretended to play hooky, but she was really just like pissed and waiting for my mother, to get home. And she's like, wherever she is, she's going to have to come home and change before work. And like, I'm going to give it to her, like that type of a thing. But she just never came home. So lo and behold, I'll kind of skip all the details, but lo and behold, my stepfather showed up later that afternoon after school. Well, I was at school and my sister was at home doing a bunch of things, like trying to find my mother. And it's an intense thing for a 13-year-old to like have to do. Long story short, my stepfather showed up. We hadn't seen him in months because they were separated. He was already dating somebody new. And he basically literally just said, sit down. And he just blurted out after like a minute of complete silence, 2 minutes of silence. He was just, maybe just, I don't know if he was trying to find the nerve. I mean, I later found out why, but I'll explain that in a second. But he just blurted out, look, I'm just going to tell you, your mother is dead. And so we found out that my mother had been brutally murdered. She had been beaten to death. And her body had been left on the side of the road, and it was discovered. And it was actually not that far, actually, from the police department. It was just an insane story. It was an insane time. And, once she was gone, like I said, when you think about how, the gravitational pull of a planet like that, like that's what my mother was to me. And so when she was like gone and she disappeared like that, it was like all the little planets that went around her just went spinning out. And so all of a sudden, I didn't have a place where I belonged. My stepfather didn't want us. My biological father, it was like shit show of epic proportions. So my life literally changed in an instant. I lost my home. I lost my mother. I lost things that were familiar. I had to go live with an aunt and uncle that I didn't really know. And I stayed with them for about 4.5 years till I went off to college, Boston University. And I was on my own from 17 on pretty much. And I was suffering a lot, as you can imagine, right? Like dead, murdered mother. This shit does not happen to you, right? Like even if you grow up in an environment where there's impending violence all the time, you don't think that that's going to happen. And especially not to the person on the planet that you love the most, like unabashedly. And it changed me, and I suffered a lot, and I felt victimized by the world, and I felt like I was at the mercy of the world, and that that the world was the cause of my unhappiness, that I was at the effect of whatever external circumstances. But that was true for me as a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old. But here's what I knew. At some point, I always loved to read. I always loved books. I'm a storyteller and a writer and a reader, and books saved me. Books saved me. And once I graduated from BU, I ended up moving out to California. And when I got out to California, in 91, it was at the start of really like the self-help time. And like, you're too young to like know this, but this was the age of like Oprah and Marianne Williamson and Tony Robbins and Iyanla Van Zant and like, Hay House, like, all these, Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra, like all these guys were like pumping out books. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And back then there weren't coaches, there weren't spiritual mentors, like these gigs that you and I now currently have did not exist. So books were my teacher. And I couldn't even afford books. So I used to just go to the bookstore and just sit on the floor and read stuff. And so slowly but surely, my introduction, one day I was really into weightlifting and stuff like that. I became a personal trainer. And I was in California. I had no car. I was taking the bus everywhere. Try to live in LA, like not have a vehicle is like hell. But I would go to the bookstore all the time. And one time I was in the bookstore, and because I was really into bodybuilding and all that and weightlifting, and I was like walking towards the health section or the muscle section, whatever. And all of a sudden I heard a voice in my head. And it said, you should go to the self-help section because you could really use some help.
Wow. Was it your voice or was it someone else's voice?
It wasn't my own voice. I knew it wasn't mine. I knew it didn't belong to me. And I often talk about how, we always have the voice for Holy Spirit or the inner teacher. Some people call it intuition, gut instinct, knowing. I don't care what you call it. That voice for love, for the divine, God, source, whatever you call it, is always there. But you know what voice always speaks first and is always loudest? The ego. And so I knew that voice really well too, because that little bastard was mean, right? Like that one, that's the voice that comes for you. You know what I mean? And it was neither of those. It was not a voice that I recognized. So I knew it was something beyond me that was coming through me. And for whatever reason, I was smart enough to listen. And I walked over to that section, and literally nobody else is around me. And all of a sudden this book just goes boop and falls off the shelf and drops at my feet. And I was like, what the? And like, I picked up this book, and it was A Return to Love from Marianne Williamson, which I say is the gateway drug to A Course in Miracles. Yeah. So that I couldn't afford the book at that moment, A Course in Miracles, because when I read it, like it says on the front, A Return to Love, Thoughts and Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And I thought, first of all, that version of the book, which I still have, she was like this on the cover, like, right, like that old shot from like Napoleon Dynamite, like the fist on the thing. And I was like, who's this broad? Like that, where I come from, we're always like, what's her story? Like, that's what we're thinking. So I pick it up, I read the title, and I think, well, shit, I could use a miracle. So I start to read the book. And it was the first time that anybody had ever talked about, quote unquote, God in that particular way. It was the first time that anybody talked about love and forgiveness in that particular way.
What was that?
And it was,
in what way? What way did it explain it, or what way did it language it in a way that resonated with you?
Hold on. I'm just trying to close out. Did you just hear that ding? Because I was trying to close out. Hold on one sec, so we don't get
technology,
any more of that external.
hey?
I don't want that external noise. Yeah. So what I mean by that is, I grew up a Catholic kid. And I often say, like, I had a very short period of time where I was in Catholic school. We eventually got kicked out because my parents weren't paying the bills, and we were just, I don't know, I don't think they were prepared to deal with us. I was there for a very short period of time, but I often say that my time there, like the nuns, taught me to fear God more than to love God. And it was taught to me that like God was something outside of myself. It was a conditional love that I had to earn. And if I wasn't good, I was going to hell. And I always thought that's kind of a screwed up thing. Like if God's all loving and merciful, I don't understand this other side where I'm being judged. Like, why is there even a judgment day? Like, I don't get this. And it never really, even though I was drawn to the magic and the mystery and the mysticism of like Saint Francis and these cool saints and the compassionate Mother Mary. And I just think Jesus is the coolest dude to like walk the face of the earth, because he was like love incarnate. There was so many things in the rituals and incense. There was so much in the stained, like the buildings. I was like, oh my God. So there were things about it I loved. The pews and even the ritual. Like the thing about Catholic kids is we like prayed with our whole bodies. We sat and we stood and we kneeled and we got up and we walked to communion and we put our hands out and we did the sign. We did these weird things, right? The rituals. And I was like, I loved it. But at the same time, the whole confession thing. And I had a situation with a priest one time where, he yelled at me one of these times in confession, and it really, really, like, it changed me. And so when I went to the front of the church, I just said, and I haven't forgotten about the Marianne Williamson question, but when I went to the front of the church, after he yelled at me for not knowing my act of contrition, now little did he know, I'm like, whatever it is, 8 months out from having a murdered mother, my whole life has been blown apart. I'm still in shock. I'm probably having a touch of the PTSD, living with total strangers. And he traumatizes me by like yelling at me in this place that's supposed to be a safe and sacred place. And my sister was outside, the booth. I always call it like the booth, the panel, like the secret squirrel panel where they like slide it across, like, and you immediately have to go in there as if you're a sinner. Like you're already like, I'm bad and beneath this thing. It's just a messed up system sometimes. So after he like punished me, told me to go say my Hail Marys and all that shit, I went to the front of the church and I kneeled down. And I was raging. Like I was so pissed because I also had this quality of, you're not the boss of me. Don't tell me what to do. Like I always had a little bit of that authority problem. So I go to the front of the church, I look up and I see this statue of Compassionate Mary. And I just knew like that motherly love, that's all I wanted. So I'm looking up at this statue and I'm feeling really connected to that. And then I look up at Jesus and I just say to him, the big, they always got to put the big crucified dead guy up there, and because you're guilty and he died for your sins. And you're like, I didn't ask him to, like, yeah. Jesus, like, oh my God. Right. So I'm sitting there, I just looked up at him and I said, that's it. I said, no more middlemen. If I got something to say to you, I'm saying it right to you. I'm like, that goes for you too, God. Right. Like, so yeah. I just, at that moment, I made a decision that I was cutting out the middlemen. And I was going right to the source. And it was just, it came from being embarrassed, humiliated, because my sister was right outside the box. So I just knew, I'm like, oh my God, she's loving hearing him yell at me right now. And when I came out, she just had that shit eating, siblings, she had that shit eating grin on her face. And I was like, and she loved it. Like, I was like, I was so mad. But God bless that priest, because his behavior taught me to deepen my own relationship to source. But here's the thing. So circle back. Here's Marianne talking about God as God is love. That God doesn't forgive because God never condemned. And it was just like radical. It was just a radical way of looking at the divine. And it allowed me to decide for myself what God meant to me and how I was going to interact with, so many people. God, I always say, when did God become a dirty word? But because we resist the way that God or source or the divine was crammed down our throats, perhaps, or the way that it was introduced to us when we were younger. That's why so many people say I'm a recovering Catholic, or I have no faith, or I don't go to church anymore, or whatever that is. And it makes us be very defensive about this idea of holiness and relationship with something greater than us. And so a lot of people put up their dukes and they build these blocks and barriers to love. So one of the things I always say to people is like, stop cock blocking God. Like, we've got to find a way to like lower our defenses, to be vulnerable, and to have a relationship that we as adults like now get to define.
Well, how do you think people do that in terms of, because bringing up a lot of things around spirit, around God, around letting this divine flow through you, there are some blocks for people. There are yes. things that come up in terms of not feeling safe, yes. in terms of if I love too much and I just allow, I'm going to be hurt. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways in which people lower those defenses so that this spirit can flow through?
I mean, I think the key thing is there has to be a container of trust. And so I think finding either people or places. It's like you're wicked good at creating community. You create a safe community where people are welcome. Can we agree on that? I think we can. So, you know, what you want, what you're trying to find really is either a community, and whether that's a yoga studio, a meditation place, teachers, right? That I always say, like, be so picky. If you, first of all, you have your own inner guru. The word guru simply means one who brings light to darkness, one who brings truth to ignorance. And we all have that built in. Nobody got skipped on the assembly line. We all have an inner guru and inner teacher. So if you are going to look outside of yourself for some sort of a teacher or a leader or a mentor or a coach or whatever, you better be wicked picky and do some homework, and not just look at their social media numbers and what they tell you. Like, pay attention, just step back for a little bit, watch how they show up in the world. Have a conversation with them if you can, or watch enough and then trust your gut. Even if you don't quite have a connection with quote unquote source or God or whatever first, your body is a really good communication device. So just slowing down and breathing and just tuning in. And one of the things I say to people is, so when you think about being whatever, close to this teacher or close in this community or in this space, how does your body feel? And if it contracts and tightens, that's a pretty good sign, right? If it feels like it softens and it opens, because love doesn't happen in a contracted state. So it's like, so how do we lower our defenses? Well, you've got to find something or someone, a system, a process, a book. Just begin with the most basic thing and ask, like, make sure that you get referrals. Like, you know, we know enough people, we're connected enough now that you can say, hey, does anybody know somebody? Knowing me, do you know somebody who might be a good fit? And if you have a lot of trauma, make sure your therapist is trauma informed. If you have X, Y, and Z, so it means that we have to participate in our own healing. We have to take responsibility, not for the things that were done to you as a little kid. Like if somebody molested you or somebody harmed you or hurt you, you were a victim to their size, weight, power. You know, if they were the ones who were supposed to feed you and take care of you and not harm you and not touch you inappropriately, of course, we were often victimized when we were little people. Once we're old enough, we have agency, we have authority, and we have the ability to now decide for ourselves, what am I going to do with these things that happened? And this is like where my whole process, your story to your glory, comes from, where we take these stories from our past and through divine alchemy and this process that I have, that we can transform it into our glory, because otherwise we're just going to be dragging around our history and our emotional baggage and our trauma. And we all have it. But we all also, like Helen Keller has a beautiful quote. I'm going to butcher it a little bit, so forgive me, Helen Keller. But it's something like, you know, the world is full of like traumas and tragedies, and it is also full of the overcoming of it. And that's what's interesting to me, is knowing that there are tools and resources and things that we can put in what I call the spiritual toolkit that can help us to lower our defenses, that can help us to learn how to be more vulnerable and trusting, that can teach us how to start a daily spiritual practice. I call it a DSP. Like when we learn, right, that we have a spiritual team on the job, that we have divine helpers that help us to align with the divine. And when we recognize that the assignment is alignment, when we can get into alignment with that, when we can shift our mind from fear to love, that's a miracle. And of course, in miracles, we say a miracle is a shift in perception in your mind from a thought system of fear to a thought system of love. And we can all do it.
I love it. Let me, before we get to back to like a spiritual practice or anything like that, I want to also talk about your story to glory type of framework and how you help people do that. But let's go back and close the loop around your story. What happens when you find the Marianne Williamson book? And just quickly give us an idea on how your life changed. What perspective change did you have from finding that book, from that day in the library, did you make any different decisions? What was the
So I was in a bookstore, and let me just say this about libraries. I love libraries. I think giving a kid a library card is the greatest thing that you can do, because it evens the playing field for poor kids. And it makes worlds and knowledge like accessible to us, and it doesn't cost a dime. So shout out to the librarians of the world. I love you. Number one. So it was just in a bookstore. What happened, Tyson, is that I read that book, and along with talking about God and source and forgiveness, first of all, she talked about forgiveness in a way, and she was talking about the principles of A Course in Miracles, which is like the peace of God through forgiveness. And I'm like, well, the forgiveness that I grew up with, there really was no forgiveness. It was like eye for an eye. Like, you hit me, you come for me, I'm coming for you worse. So I was like, wait, what? So I knew. My mother started coming to me in dreams, and she said, I've forgiven him, meaning her murderer, her killer. I've forgiven him, and now it's your turn. And I was like, I have no idea how to do that. So I get this book, A Return to Love, and she's talking about, number one, this idea, this concept of God and love. Number two, this concept of forgiveness. And number three, she was talking about how my suffering, right, my perception was my choice. That I was responsible for my thoughts, my words, my actions, and how I wanted to feel, and like, I didn't know. I swear to God, I had no idea at that age, in my early 20s, that I had a choice as to how I felt, that I could change my mind. Nobody in my life because when you're the kid of a murdered mother, anything you do, you can get away with it, because they're like, of course she's acting this way, because like, look what happened. So it was really easy to be a victim. I was a professional victim for like a little while there, because I also found out that I got something out of the dead mother murder card. It was like, oh, I could not turn in my math homework, and they're going to cut me some slack. I could fill in the blank, and they're going to cut me some slack. So I could have kept sliding along that route.
Yeah.
But when I recognized that my suffering was a choice, that I could choose to feel differently, that I could choose to see this through a new lens, that in fact, I was not at the mercy and the effect of the world, right? That I was the cause of the world I was experiencing, that my reality was made by me. It was like, holy shit, dude. And being a little bit of a control freak, because my whole childhood had been out of control, it was so comforting to know that I could control that I had a choice. And so what happened is, one of the first things I did, because Marianne lived in LA, and she lectured weekly on A Course in Miracles at like different places. And the first thing I did when I got a vehicle is I started going to her lectures. And then she did a workshop on relationships at the Agape Church, Reverend Michael Beckwith's place. And so I went, and I got to meet him and whatever. And it's too long of a story. We don't have enough time, but I get up on the mic to ask a question about relationships, but I really ended up, something like took over my body, and I ended up blurting out this thing about forgiveness. And she had me come up on stage, and we had this very powerful healing, I don't know how to explain it other than experience. And afterwards, her people came up to me and said, she wants to talk to you. Long story short, it kicked off a relationship. She called me. We ended up having a one-to-one session. And then she invited me to come travel with her. She's like, I think you should come on this spiritual pilgrimage I'm doing. So over the course of a year, I went to Egypt for 2 weeks on a spiritual pilgrimage. And then right after that, I came back and then went right back out and went on a spiritual pilgrimage with her to England and Ireland. So to Stonehenge and all the holy places. And it just changed my life. And when we were in Ireland, she invited me to come live and work for her and with her. And so that just launched that. And so I could never have planned this shit. Do you know what I'm saying? Spiritual team on the job, just divinely guiding me. But I was willing to listen. When you're a spiritual seeker and when you open the doors and you say, I always say, you can't ask the divine to guide your life and guide your steps if you are not willing to move your own damn feet. And I was a kid who, once I knew that there were better options than suffering, I always say, like, suffering's a wicked good teacher until you get a better one. So when a new teacher came on the scene in the form of A Course in Miracles and books and Marianne, et cetera, like, I went in deep. It wasn't always perfect, still very messy at times, but I was sincere in my efforts.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of questions about obviously you're learning about love, about forgiveness, about your experience of life is choice. I want to ask a few questions about when that shifted from hate to forgiveness for your mum and the murder and the murderer. When did that happen? And what was that experience like? And because what I hear is there was an inner conflict of, I'm getting something by being a victim.
Yes.
And the reason why I want to ask this is because a lot of people don't really realize sometimes that their problems are giving them something. Their problems are meeting some unconscious needs that they're unaware of. And it seems like for you got a lot of different things, and you were the victim. So a lot of people cut you slack and all those different things. What was the moment like when you started realizing there's a different option, and what did it take for you to implement that different option of forgiveness? And what was that inner conflict like, where you had to sort of break away, sort of things that it was giving you in order to receive forgiveness? What was that like?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, let's just say this. I tried a lot of things that weren't helpful first, right? Like booze and drugs and smoking cigarettes. And I think the first time I got drunk, I was 12. The first time I got high, I was 12. The first time I smoked a cigarette, messing around, I was like 8 years old. Like, I was always getting into things, and then later it becomes shopping, sex, like other things, right? To distract yourself, to numb yourself. So I tried a lot of different things and none of that shit worked, number one. But really what happened, Tyson, and I just want to state for the record, right? Like, it can be sometimes weird telling these stories because I understand that my story is not special. It's just that the details are a little bit different. But I think that there is universal in specificity. Like in the personal story, there are always going to be places where we can universally say, I get that, I understand that. So I'll just say this. So there's a quote, Leonard Cohen, the great, songwriter, whatever, he became famous for it, but really started with Rumi, the great Sufi poet Rumi. And Rumi basically says, that there is a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in. And then Leonard Cohen put it in a famous song. That's really what happened. There was a crack, and I'll tell you the story of the crack, and the light got in. And so what happened is, here I am, I'm at BU, I'm by myself. I'm so terrified that I'm going to flunk out of college. I'm there, but literally, like, on the first day of college, my aunt and uncle, I had a car, little, friend used car, drove to Boston, and they followed behind me with my shit from my bedroom, and they brought me on my first day of school, and they left, and they never came back. So I was literally on my own, and I was like, okay, trying to figure out the world and school and college and whatever. So I get there. I didn't have a phone in my room the first year because I didn't think I could afford it. I was really afraid, about spending money, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I was suffering a lot. And it was around finals. It was finals time. It was December. December, I want to say 1986. And here's all I know. They caught the guy that killed my mother. And when my mother died, it was even though it was on the TV and it was in the news and it was in the paper and all this stuff, the radio, whatever, anytime it came on or whatever, it was shut off immediately. So it was literally my mother disappeared overnight. And I was the kind of kid where not knowing what really happened was worse for me than having the graphic details. Some people are just I don't want to know. I don't want to know. I was the opposite of that. I had a very rich imagination, and my mantra as a kid was why mom? Why mom? Why mom? I felt better knowing why, and I needed to understand. I had no idea why this guy killed my mother. All I knew was that he took my favorite person on the planet, the only place that I actually felt safe. So now I'm just out in the world, terrified. Now I'm because he beat her to death. So now I'm afraid of the world. I don't know if I can trust men. I don't know that she was found half naked from the waist down. So I'm like, I think he was trying to rape her. Like, there were all these elements that were just so painful. And so all I knew was, and this is a fantasy in my mind, like, let's be really clear. I don't know that the prison was really going to let me talk to him, but I had a plan. I went in my freshman year at BU, I was 17, but I was going to turn 18, and I did. And so right after I turned 18, I was like, I'm going to go to I'm an adult now. I'm going to go to the prison, and I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to ask him to his face, why did you do this? That was my plan. And I had it all figured out, right? Because once I knew why, once I had the reason from this external source, then I could have peace. Then I could be, not maybe happy, but I could have some inner comfort and peace, because I would at least understand why this thing happened. Because why would somebody want to beat my mother to death? Like, it just made no sense, right? So my boyfriend at the time, I didn't have a phone in my room, so I'm down in the lobby. I call him from a payphone, and I get on the phone, and he's being like suspiciously nice to me. like he was always nice, but I was like, when something's going on. And I was like, hey, Francis, like, what's happening? So the guy that killed my mother, his last name was Caravo. So after a couple of minutes, he just blurts out, so here I am. Now, nobody knows. This is this is a thing I kept close to my chest, that I'm going to go and talk to this guy at the prison and finally get my answers, right? So he all of a sudden, he just blurts out, Caravo is dead. And I was just devastated, because now not only am I not going to get the answers, now I'm going to have to keep suffering because I don't have the answers. And this guy held all the power. He knew what really happened that night. So whatever, long story, I run upstairs, I freak out, I cry, like I just have a total meltdown, devastated. So I finished my finals like 2 days later, a day and a half later, I go and I just dropped some. I go home. Whatever home means, because I really don't have a home, because I don't live anywhere. Like, my aunt and uncle dropped me off. I literally have no home now. So on the holidays and breaks, I'm like, where am I supposed to stay? So a lot of times I just crashed at my sister's house or whatever. But I came home, and at the holidays, we would go to my stepfather's house. We would go many places. We'd go to my aunt and uncle's, we'd go to my grandparents, we'd go to my stepfather's house. And I walk in the door, my sister's behind me, we come in. And now my step family, I'm like an Irish kid. My step family is like all Italian and Portuguese. They're loud. There's all this food on the table, Crown Royal, calamari, marinara, like everybody's fucking making a lot of noise. And when we came into the alcove, they couldn't see us, but we could see and hear them. And I hear my Uncle Manny, right? Like, he's got his friggin' glass, and he's like going like, ding, 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 ding. He wants to make a toast. I'm like, oh boy, here we go, my Uncle Manny. And he literally goes like, he raises the glass and he says, to Paul Caravo, may that cocksucker rot in hell. And everybody's like, salute, everybody's cheering. And I just, like, in that moment, here's the crack. In that moment, I realize whatever's going on inside of me in that moment, I don't feel the way that the rest of them do. What did you feel in that moment? I'm going to tell you, what I felt was pretty bad, because I knew that this man who had taken his own life, he hung himself in prison, that he was also somebody's son, and he was also somebody's husband, and he was also somebody's dad. And I knew that he had little kids, younger than me at that time. So at that time I'm 18. And I'm like, I think his kids were like something like maybe 5, or like little kids. And the thought that ran through my head, honestly, and I'm just going to be blunt, and I have a potty mouth, so I forgive if there's little ears, just block them ahead of time. And what I said was, what kind of fucking Christmas can they be having right now? Like, I got my family in this room cheering, saluting, and I'm just standing there, and I am struck with and boom, that's when Spirit said, we have an opportunity here, because compassion has entered the room. And as soon as I felt that, there was an opportunity for healing. There was an opportunity for forgiveness, because it was the moment that I stopped seeing him as a monster, literally. And I started to see him as a deeply flawed human being. And what happened, Tyson, is that I met him in that moment with curiosity instead of judgment, because I also had the thought, what had to have happened to him and his life and his childhood that could make him capable? So I'm finally going to answer the question about how do I end up being a spiritual mentor, which is this. It really occurs to me, not in that moment, but later on, it occurs to me when I started to lead with curiosity and wanting to understand people's stories. I think when you know somebody's story, like you really are willing to listen, it is almost impossible to understand them in some way. It's almost impossible not to forgive them. And you might find that you come to love them, or at the very least have deep compassion for them. And so what I realized is, well, if this guy, you know, they say hurt people hurt people. And I always say happy people tend not to hurt people. Not on purpose anyway. And what I realized is that this guy had no capability in that moment for whatever he was feeling, whatever rage, whatever came up in him, that he could kick and punch my mother to death. He did not have the ability to pause. He did not have the ability to control his emotions or himself. He did not have any spiritual tools in his toolkit to stop. And I just think to myself, Jesus, if this guy knew prayer or meditation or breath work or the pause or the ability to just stop. So in that rumble between his madness, if Holy Spirit or Spirit or whatever, a pause had a chance in between thoughts and actions, if this guy had had some spiritual tools, my mother might still be alive.
Mm. And let me ask you a couple of questions, because what's the overall meaning you're giving it now? Because if the meaning beforehand was all about him and hatred, and you needed these answers, and if you didn't have these answers, then your life was going to be in turmoil. Now that you had this awakening of forgiveness and compassion and healing, what's the meaning you give it now in terms was it meant to happen? Is it all still in divine timing? Is it something that happens for you? What's the meaning now?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, that phrase, right? Like, and who knows who said it first? I remember Tony Robbins saying it back in like 91 or 2. That, you know, some version of, I remember Tony saying back then that, you know, we'll keep doing what we need to do until it becomes too painful for us to stop. So I knew my old way wasn't working. But here's what I will say. We've all heard that phrase, right? It's not happening to me. It's happening for me. It doesn't feel that way when you're in it. And a lot of spiritual wisdom that we glean often comes with time, age, doing the fucking work daily dedication. I call it the 5 Ds of DSP, the 5 Ds of daily spiritual practice, which is daily, non-negotiable, dedication, determination, discipline, and devotion. So I just feel like I look back now and I think, if I had not lost my mother when I did, how I did, I would not be who I am today. I would not be doing this work. Joseph Campbell talks about it like, you know, that dark cave that you fear to enter. It holds the treasure that you seek. And that's the arc of the story to glory. It's like knowing that we're living our stories, whether we know it or not. Everybody has stories, and telling stories is a total fucking blast. Until your story starts to tell you that you're not good enough, you're not lovable, you're not worthy. I'm really into looking at the stories of our lives, our shitty first drafts, as Anne Lamott calls them, these shitty first drafts, and then revising them, assigning new meaning to them. Because so often the things that happen to us, we're at ages when our brains are literally not even fully developed. We don't have the emotional maturity or capacity to understand that it wasn't our fault, that we were lovable, that it wasn't like, we really do feel victimized when we're 5 and 8 and 12 and 15 and whatever. If we don't stop at some point when we get older and look at it. And that's what I believe. I believe that we have a deep spiritual glory. I always say, right? I was saying it before we get on the call, like that inner GPS, which I always say is God's pretty smart. And we're always trying to just like navigate, like white knuckling everything. Like we're always just like, But when we like slow down and we start to develop a deeper relationship to self and source and spirit, miracles become possible and things can change. So I wouldn't go back. Like, look, of course, do I wish my mother was still alive? Yes. But I think that what happened, as brutal, grotesque, awful, violent, vicious, as it was. And I've seen the photos. I'm writing a memoir. I've gone and looked at the physical evidence twice, and it is horrifying. But I will still say this, that there is a glory that lies within that story. And it was one of the greatest gifts. It was one of the greatest gifts that ever happened to me, because it transformed me. It made me a much more deeply conscious and compassionate and empathetic human being. It's why I'm vegan. It's why I've been vegan for 18 years, because I cannot bear the thought of participating in the suffering of other beings consciously and knowingly, because I know that all beings want to live. I know that my mother tried. She tried to get away from him because she wanted to live. I know she fought for her life. So there's just no way. Like I look back, everything. I always, like, again, my little sign, it says spiritual team on the job for a reason, because it's all unfolding. Call it divine timing, call it divine grace, call it, kismet, call it coincidence, call it synchronicity, call it dharma. I don't care what, we have all these names. Here's what I know. The divine loves me. The divine uses me. I have an individual curriculum and assignment. I have to be brave enough to accept it. I have to show up. Rabindranath Tagore has this beautiful quote where he says, everything that belongs to you, everything that is yours will come to you if you create the capacity to receive it. And I think in spiritual work, we are creating the capacity to receive whatever shows up at our door.
I love
and
that.
Sometimes, yeah. So
that's
just stop
cool.
me, because I could.
Well, here's the thing. We can definitely, we definitely can feel and hear why you're a storyteller.
Thank you, honey.
But I would just love to just let you go for hours, because this is just, there's so much. I didn't even have to ask any questions. There's so much wisdom that people are taking away here. There's so much guidance. And I can feel that people are hearing your story, but also at some level applying it to their own life, whether it be in their personal relationships, whether it be in their business, right? They're taking this way. But before we finish up, I want to quickly just ask you a couple of questions before you can share where people can find you. But what are 3 things in hearing all of this?
Yes.
What do you think are the 3 major takeaways that someone can hone in and start to practice in their everyday world? What are the 3 lessons that you sort of learned by going through all this that someone else can apply in their life right now?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we have to let go of the idea that we have to do it all on our own. I think that finding, whether, like I said, it's a group, a mentor, a coach, or even you just finding your own inner teacher and inner wisdom. So creating space where your spiritual, here's the thing that's so interesting. Like, it's a business podcast, right? Your whole life is your spiritual life. Your business is your spiritual life. Your lovemaking is your spiritual life. The food you eat, where you shop, the way you talk to yourself and others, your whole life is your spiritual life. So if we don't create space for deeper knowing of our true selves, we are literally like little zombies and robots and puppets, like just walking through the world, being tossed about by our reactions to everything. So I think it's so important that we create quiet time. And sometimes quiet time, if you have a lot of trauma, sitting for meditation and prayer can be next to impossible. If you have a lot of PTSD, being still. So there are ways to be with the divine, God, source, love, whatever, the universe, whatever, higher power, whatever you want to call it. where you can do walking meditation. So I think it's a combination. I always say, like, to me, prayer is when we talk to source, God, love. Meditation is when we listen. So we have to become generous listeners. We have to become, so I always talk about it like we have to, first of all, I call it the 4 C's and the 4 A's. I know you asked for 3 things, but it's really like we have to be willing to have clarity and awareness. And then we have to have compassion and acceptance for whatever is going on, whoever we've been, coming from our past and our histories. And then the step that so many people skip because they want to go right to action, right? I always say, no. We have to recognize there's a problem, clarity and awareness. We have to have compassion for ourselves, how we got there, and this, whatever it is, not this acceptance, this self-forgiveness and love. Then we have to have connection and alignment. And that's the missing piece. That's why I'm not a life coach. It's why I am a spiritual mentor on purpose, because I think spirit is the missing piece. I think a lot of us have spiritual amnesia, and I think we need to sit our asses down. And whether, again, that's a walking meditation. Some people, some traumatized clients I've had in the past, they like to row or do something repetitious, like riding their bike or running. That's when they are able to get quiet enough to drop in. So it's not for me to tell you what you should do, but please be curious enough about how you feel most connected to whatever you call it. And I think that it's so important that we create trust, and we create trust by spending time. Like if you were going to create a relationship with somebody new, and women know this intuitively, if we're going to have a deep relationship with somebody new, what do we need to do? Spend time together. Ask questions, talk, deeply listen. That's how trust is built. And it's no different with your spiritual team, and a teacher, Holy Spirit, God, source, whatever you call it. There is nothing more important, I think, on this planet than deepening your connection to your self, source, and spirit, because that is what's ultimately going to improve your relationship with everything else in your life.
I agree. Totally agree. I think there was 3 in there.
I don't know. There's a lot. I'm not really good at doing bulleted.
No, it was my, that was my, I just wanted to see if you could throw 3 out there, but there's probably about 15 in there that people can,
sorry.
Take away. But no, this is awesome. This is so cool. How can people find out more about you and what you're doing, and about the nest and all these different things you've got going online? Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best place is to just go right to my website, which is Karen Kenney, KENNEY.com. And on there, they'll be able to, my new website's about to be launched any day now. So they'll be able to find out about spiritual mentoring, my Course in Miracles mini course, the Nest, which is my spiritual membership and community, writing work, like all of it. And my podcast, The Karen Kenney Show, it's like one-stop shopping. And then on Instagram, it's just, Karen Kenney Live, LIVE. Same thing on Facebook, same thing on Instagram, same thing on LinkedIn, same, all the places. So if you just Google it, you'll find me eventually. You know what I mean?
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your time. No doubt people are going to want to check out the podcast and hear you just shout wisdom that they can basically improve their life and improve their spiritual connection to themselves and to with spirit. So, I mean, everyone's going to want to jump on and get on board, but I want to thank you for just sharing your story, getting on here and just being very open, vulnerable, honest in a way that's from a place of compassion and service. I think that's what, you're clearly living it and being the example of what you teach. So I think that's what's most important. But thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you want to add in that just will make this conversation and this interview feel complete?
I just want to say thank you so much, sweetheart, because you are such a kind and generous host. And in the short time that I've come to know you, and I've seen you in action a few times, I also, and I'm not a tit for tat person. I don't just say things to say them. I don't just say things to be nice, but I've seen you in action, and I really feel like you are living your purpose, that you are in divine alignment, and that you are answering the call of your heart and your spirit, and that you're in service to something greater than you. And I think that, your listeners, one of the things why Michelle and Damien, our mutual friends, were like, you have to be on his show, is that they're like, they know I'm wicked picky, first of all. And I'm like, I only want to talk, and it sounds mean, but I don't mean it that way. But I want to be associated. I always say the only things I have in this world are my name, right? My name, my word, my reputation, and my voice. So who I associate with, who I collaborate with, I'm very particular about that. And if I find out something that I don't like I will do what I need to do. But you are so genuinely in service. In fact, do I have it? Okay. This is how much you don't even know this. I wrote this quote down, you guys. I just want to read something. One of my first times meeting Tyson, this is what he said. He said, "Who can I send your way that will be an ideal client or collaborator?" And he says, so to be in service is to basically to let go of any expectation of getting anything in return. And I thought, this is a person I want to know. Because this is a person who genuinely cares about others and gives with no expectation. And that is a rare and beautiful and powerful thing. So just thank you for inviting me in and for hosting me and for having me, because this is how we're going to do it, brother. Ram Dass, this is the last thing I'll say. Ram Dass so beautifully says, we're all just walking each other home. And this is one of the ways that we do it, is we do it together, and you make it a little bit easier.
Wow, thank you. I could let you talk all day. I'll stop you there. Thank you so much for your kind words. I'll definitely be reviewing that on the recording. So that was just so sweet. I appreciate it. And anytime you want to jump into the serving circle, anytime you want to get on the call, you know where to find me, because this is so impactful. I love the work you're doing. I love the energy at which you do it from. And
thank you, brother.
Happy to be on this journey with you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.